Ritwik. Thank you. Yes, we are recording this call, so I hope everyone is okay with that. My name is Aparupa Datta. I'm from Y East. Sorry, I'm not able to start my video because I'm having some problems with my connection. My audio won't be that great if I start my video. So we are very happy to welcome our experts from Legal Initiative for Forest and Environment, live as we call it, Mr. Ritwik Datta, Mr. Rahul Chaudhary, and Ms. Kankana Das, who have so humbly and gladly agreed to do this masterclass for us. Live, as we call it, is a national level public interest environmental law group in India. I will let the experts speak more about live towards the end of the session. Kankana would let you know more about how you can collaborate with LIFE as an organization. Before I move on to the details of our speakers, I will quickly give you an introduction of the co-organizers of this masterclass, that is Y East and YFS India Alliance. Y East is an aggregating platform for organizations which are based in East and Northeast India and organizations which are BD. We aggregate them on a common platform, which is Y East, to generate collaborative projects and impact. More about Y East will be shared in the follow-up email that we send after the class. YFS India Alliance is a platform which brings together like-minded, youth-oriented organizations focused on SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, and SDG 13 to help India achieve its targets on these goals, with youth as the accelerator. We have 40 plus members, and we are soon going to complete our first anniversary this December, which is quite exciting. Moving on to our expert speakers, and then I'll hand over the mic to them. Mr. Ritwik Datta focuses exclusively on environmental litigation and has worked with community, civil society groups, and affected citizens in bringing environmental issues before the court. His principal focus is the National Green Tribunal, where he has served as the secretary of NGT Bar Association. He's an Ashoka Fellow and is the recipient of the Carl Zeiss Roll of Honor 2005 and many other prestigious awards. He's the founder and the trustee of Legal Initiative for Forest and Environment, and he would be leading the session on need for environmental law. Moving on to Kankana Das, who has been the main point of contact with Y East and YFS India Alliance on curating this session. We are so grateful to her for her help on this. She has a master's degree in environmental science from IISWB Calcutta and works for the East Zone Office of Life as an analyst. She has over 15 years experience in the field of environment and advocacy, and we're so happy to have her on board. More about her later on. Rahul Chaudhary, who is the third speaker who would be educating us more on the solid waste management rules, is practicing before the National Green Tribunal and is engaged in assisting community, civil society organizations and individuals in questioning environmentally disastrous projects and more. Welcome all of you to the masterclass. And now I will pass on the mic to Mr. Ritwik Datta for more. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm audible and I'm very grateful for inviting, because though we are based in Delhi, as I said, for most of us, our heart is still in the Northeast, and Northeast is very special. And that is why, in order to protect a lot of interest of Northeast, we are here in Delhi and in Kolkata. And, I'll, in this time that has been given to me, I'll focus on, though the topic is on need of environmental law and case studies, I'll try to share my experiences of taking up cases, the challenges that are faced, and what are the complex nature with regard to environmental law cases that come, the complexities that are there. So what I have tried to do is actually prepare a PowerPoint, which makes it, for me to arrive to the most difficult part of my session, which is somehow getting the PowerPoint to the share screen mode. So I'll start with my, so can I please try putting the share screen? It's on, right?
Yes, it is on. You can share your screen.
Yes. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, great. So half an hour is what I have. What we have today, the issue is, why do we need environmental law? I think all of us understand the need for law. And so I'm not going to go in depth, but what I'm going to try to show is how law as a tool can be used in order to protect the environment as well as community rights that are there. And through this process that we have over the last 15, 20 years used, we found that despite all the challenges that one faces, it is still possible, to use creatively law as well as legal institutions in order to protect the environment. So if I go in, this is broadly the laws that we have on environment: the Wildlife Protection Act, the Forest Conservation Act, the Environment Protection Act, the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act. Now, if you look at it very clearly, all of these are post-70s. And in a way, it reflects the change in the political leadership that took place. So 70s was the time when you had Indira Gandhi being the prime minister. And there was a lot of interest, a recognition that, we must do something for the environment. If you look at, the earlier laws, for example, the Indian Easement Act, all the laws of 1800s, what do they say? They actually say it is the right of every person to pollute every river and stream, because pollution was a sign of progress. And towards the 70s and 80s, it was recognized that, we cannot go on with what was called a business as usual. And so you had the Wildlife Protection Act, you had the Forest Conservation Act. And if you look at the Forest Conservation Act itself, it had a very interesting history. Forest was essentially a subject meant for the state. The central government of India has very little role in protection of forest. So when the state of Kerala wanted to build a dam on what is called the Silent Valley, there is very little that the government of India could do in order to stop the state of Kerala from building the dam. So therefore, what the government of India did was use the amendment that took place in the constitution, wherein forest was moved from the state list to the concurrent list. That is, it empowers both the center and the state government to actually come out with a law. And what really happened there was, an ordinance was issued in 1980. And through an ordinance, the state, the central government took over the power to actually decide whether forest land can be used for non-forest purpose or not. So this is how the Forest Conservation Act came in. Air pollution, water laws, they were all an outcome of different international commitments which were there. So if you look very clearly, these are the statutory framework. But then law are not just about what is there in the statutory law. Law is not about what is there in the constitution itself. It also depends upon principles and various judicial precedents that takes place. So one of the guiding principles that the Supreme Court in number of cases has propounded was the precautionary principle, which many of you would know, that absence of scientific proof is not a reason for us not to take preventive steps. A very important part of environmental law is reversal of burden of proof, which principally means that in normal general law, it is always the person who comes to the court to prove as to how the person has been affected, what has been, why the other party is guilty. In environmental cases, it is not the person who comes to the court, rather it's the other way around. That is, the person who wants to interfere with the environment is the person who is required to show how their activity is environmentally benign. Polluter pay principle is there, which means that those who pollute must pay. And the principle of both sustainable development and absolute liability, that you cannot in environmental matters state that it is an act of God. It happened despite you taking every single precaution. No, if a damage has happened, you are liable. That's it. And many doctrines have come in. You know, we start with what is called the public trust doctrine, which is propounded in the famous MC Mehta versus Kamal Nath, that the state is not the owner of the resources. This is a very, very important part. Our legal system based on English common law includes public trust doctrine. The state is only a trustee. And what does a trustee do? One of the basic rule of a trustee is that a trustee cannot use the trust for the purpose for which the trust was not created. So if I today run a trust which is supposed to protect the environment, I cannot do an act like drilling oil. That's not permissible here. So therefore, what the Supreme Court said in MC Mehta case was that, you know, you are under a legal duty to protect this, because the state, the government is not the owner of these natural resources, whether they are in the form of lake, rivers and all. It says that public is the owner and not the state. But there was a problem. The problem is that the public itself can use it for any purpose which the public can regard as their benefit. So therefore, what happened was very interesting, that in Center for Environmental Law versus WWF of India versus Union of India, which was a very interesting case concerning relocation of lion, the Supreme Court said that the public trust doctrine must not be merely for the benefit of the public, that is human being, but for the best interest of flora and fauna, wildlife and so on. The doctrine of public trust has to be addressed in that perspective. That's very, very critical in the way it has gone. And it also says public trust doctrine does not prohibit alienation of natural resources. What it requires is a high level of judicial scrutiny. And again, a very, very interesting doctrine that has come in is the doctrine of parens patria. That is, the court is under a duty, under the doctrines of parens patria, to take care of animals, since they're unable to take care of themselves as human beings. Now, if you look at the entire jurisprudence, a lot of emphasis was always given on the fact as to whether, whether the petitioners in this case have done due diligence or not. In Animal Welfare Board versus Nagraj, the Supreme Court said that, you know, it's not just a duty of the petitioner. It is not just a duty of the state. The court is under an obligation to act like parents of animals because they are unable to take care of themselves. Then we had principles like the species interest standard. Now take a decision that is in the best interest of the species. It's very, very important standard that comes in. Every species has an inherent right to live and shall be protected by law subject to exceptions provided. Animals also have honor and dignity, which cannot be arbitrarily deprived of, and its rights and privacy have to be respected and protected from unlawful attack. It's very interesting. The right to privacy, so far as human beings are concerned, actually came subsequently in the Aadhaar judgment. But the right of privacy, at least as a judicial interpretation, happened in fact way back in 2014. It's another thing that has not been followed. It's an area where, you know, there is a role of civil society, activists, academicians, and others to see that these are followed. But as principles, these have come in and were applied. Ecocentric principle, you know, this is again a very, very important judicial principle. Environmental justice can be achieved if we drift away from anthropocentric to ecocentric. Yes, most of our principles, the Supreme Court recognized sustainable development, polluter pay principle, intergenerational equity, all these great principles have one basic fault. And the fault that they have is they focus on human beings and not on animals and non-human creatures. And so in Supreme Court in 2012, the judgments are all given, the citations are given. you are all free to use my presentation, recognizes that we must move from an anthropocentric approach to an ecocentric approach. And this quote said, ecocentrism is nature-centered, humans are part of nature, and even if a species does not have any value for humans, they still have to be protected. That's it. So if there is a species, it says that is nature-centered, where humans are part, and human interest does not take automatic precedence, and humans have obligations for non-humans independent of human interest. You know, we always say, well, we must protect it for the next generation. No, I think even if they are not for any benefit for the present generation and for the next generation, every species has a right to exist. Pollute pay principle, we all know, but there's a problem. The Supreme Court itself recognized that the way pollute pay principle has been applied is essentially meaning that, you know, as long as you pay, you have the right to pollute. I'll now come to certain important judicial interpretation. You know, the National Green Tribunal is there, but there is also very important judgments that come. I've covered a lot of decisions and principles set by the Supreme Court, but also it's important to focus on many of the orders that have come even from the high courts. Now, for example, the Uttarakhand High Court gave a decision which is currently stayed by the Supreme Court, which recognizes rivers as living entity. There are many sides to it. You know, some people, and rightfully so, say, well, the judgment is flawed on various jurisprudential basis. But the fact is that the court recognized that rivers should be treated as a living entity. There's a very interesting judgment, and I'm happy to share that, you know, I was part of the proceedings representing the State Biodiversity Board, where the Uttarakhand High Court, in what is called the Divya Pharmacy judgment, and I emphasize on this because Koruna will be speaking later on it, but this judgment is landmark because it says that every company, every corporate entity which it extracts biological resources, whether in the form of seeds, bark, roots, fruits, which have been traditionally conserved and protected by communities, that right has to be recognized. And how do they recognize it? By insisting that every company is duty bound to share a part of the revenue with the community that has traditionally conserved and protected these biological resources. In this particular case, the Uttarakhand Biodiversity Board had imposed a fee on Divya Pharmacy, which is the company of Baba Ramdev. They were required to pay how much? 0.1% of the total revenue. And revenue to be given to the local community who have actually protected the resources. All across Northeast, you have communities that have protected natural resources, living natural resources in the form of plants, in the form of roots, in form of leaves, in form of seeds. It is a traditional knowledge that they've had. These are protected, these have been conserved. If somebody takes benefit, one is getting the benefit in terms of raw material, but the greater benefit that comes is in terms of the final product. So the access and benefit sharing as per the Nagoya Protocol requires these companies to actually share part of their revenue. Baba Ramdev's company said, well, I am an Indian company. I'm Swadeshi, but we are not required to share it with the local community. Only a foreign company is required to share part of the revenue with the local community in India. The High Court did not agree with it, and and gave a very significant judgment, which I'm going to just share with you. This is what the Supreme Court, the Uttarakhand High Court says. Baba Ramdev's Divya Pharmacy bound to share profits with local communities under the Biodiversity Act. And therefore, it was one of the first instances where Ramdev was directed to share a part of a profit, and how much one is talking about, 0.1% of the profit of the revenue that is there with the local community. The court said that in a very landmark judgment, it is still holding ground. It has not been challenged in the Supreme Court. Now, in view of the time that I have, I would like to share 2 to 3 cases which concern the Northeast. And this is a case that I was involved, as Life as an institution was involved for over a decade. What you see in the middle is a very, very sacred site called the Parshuram Kund. This is the Lohit River in Arunachal Pradesh. More than 1,000, 1,500 or even more hectares of prime forest, including this river and including the area across the Kund, were all to be submerged under what is called the Lower Demwe Hydroelectric Project of 1,700 megawatts. We challenged the case on behalf of a local petitioner, Bimal Gogoi, before the National Green Tribunal. We lost few of the rounds, but we continued for years and years. And what was important there was not an ideological stand that you don't want that. We wanted to show that how the dam builders, the government, the Ministry of Environment and Forest, all of them had fudged information in order to secure approval for this project. So if you look here, now, this is a mandatory form that is required under the Forest Conservation Act. What it requires is the government has to fill up saying that whether there are any rare, endangered and unique species of flora and fauna are found in the area and the details that are there. The answer that was given was no rare, endangered and unique species of flora and fauna are found in the project area at the time of inspection. Now, if you look very clearly, the question that was asked was that are there any unique species of flora and fauna found in the area? The area means the entire geographical location, including beyond the project site. This person, whoever has filled it up, the forest officer, says no rare, endangered and unique species of flora and fauna are found in the project area at the time of inspection. So if the inspection is done at 12 o'clock in the afternoon for 15 minutes, and they find that we don't find any elephants, we don't find any tiger, well, the answer to them is it is not there. So what we look here is, and if you look carefully here, and I can just show it to you, what they found is that the very same officer in another document, which they did not submit to the while seeking approval, has found that this particular area has tiger, has leopard, has clouded leopard, hula gibbon, the only species of ape found in India, and slow loris, fishing cat, all of them are found. So it is impossible that a species like tiger could be treated as a species which is neither endangered, rare or threatened. Now, again, the question that is asked is whether any rare, endangered and unique species are found in the area, and the answer is no. And if you look above, it's very clear that this is located at a distance of only 50 meters from the Kamlang Wildlife Sanctuary, just 50 meters away. Northeast itself is a biodiversity hotspot. Arunachal is among the hottest of hotspots. And here they want to divert more than nearly 2,000 hectares of forest land. And they say that despite presence of tiger, leopard, elephants and hula gibbon, they say no endangered species are found in this area. And they recommended the project. And I must tell you that after years of litigation, it became the first hydropower project where the minister had overruled the objection of an internal committee called the National Board for Wildlife and said, I approve the project. We went to the National Green Tribunal, challenged the decision of the minister, and finally got an order where the environmental clearance given to the project stands suspended. Over a period of time, that suspension translated because the suspension later became almost today is a cancellation, because the project proponent who was there has withdrawn from the project because of nearly 10 years of litigation and their inability to actually do a detailed study to show that the construction of the project will not be detrimental to the wildlife of the area. What is also interesting here of Dembe I mentioned is it's not just about forest, it's not just about wildlife. It is also a cultural issue, because that area is regarded as sacred, both by the local tribe as well as Hindus, even from Nepal. They come to it. But all of these were undermined in order to get the project approved. I end my talk by giving an example of another landscape in Arunachal Pradesh itself. This is concerning a species called the black-necked crane. And river, it's called the Nyamjangchu. On that river, a project of a group called Namjangchu Hydropower Corporation of Bhilwara Group, they wanted to build a hydropower project. The locals were essentially Buddhist monks of Monpa community opposed it. They took part in the public hearing, and their point was that when you prepared the environmental impact assessment report for the project, you made no mention of the fact that this area is the wintering site of the black-necked crane. Now, it's a vulnerable species. It comes from China during the winter time. Now, the EIA consultant obviously could not have mentioned the species because the study was done during the summertime. So the birds don't come in summer, they come in winter. So we took up the matter on behalf of the Save Mon Region Federation before the National Green Tribunal and argued that this is the habitat of the wintering site of the black-necked crane. And the case went on for many years, and our luck wasn't really good, because for those first 2 to 3 years that the case went on, the birds did not come in the winter time. So that made the dam proponents and the lawyers say that actually we are making a false claim. The birds may have come previously, but they do not come any longer. So the judgment, the final argument was reserved for a particular day. We had almost spent close to 3 years arguing this matter. And we had almost given up hope because it was during the winter time, the birds did not come. And that time also the judge said, well, last opportunity to argue a matter, we are going to post it next week. And after that, we are going to pronounce the judgment. We were very clear that somehow the judge is not convinced about a fact. The birds are not coming. And that made it very difficult. I don't know what happened, but just one day before the hearing of the matter, the final day of the argument, the judges, the birds decided to come all the way from China and land. And just 2 of those birds came at exactly the same dam site. And the Times of India did a story. Rare cranes arrive in Tawang, stake claim to hydro project site. And this for us was the sign of victory, because we could prove after years that where the project site is actually the site for the birds to come during the winter time. It is only one of the 2 wintering sites in Arunachal. It's an extremely critical site. But luckily for us, had they not arrived on that day, we would not have succeeded. And finally, NGT order helped save the rare bird habitat. We succeeded, and till date, the birds keep on coming. And this is one of the small instances where litigation as a tool, understanding the law as a tool to protect rights of communities, to protect wildlife, to protect rivers, and ultimately the rule of law itself is very much possible. There are a lot of stories where we have not succeeded, but we always learn. And the very fact that we are raising a voice against the injustice also helps in developing faith in the system that exists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ritwik. And hello, I was a bit late. I feel so privileged to be a witness of this session. There are wonderful stories that you just told, and what is very powerful about them is that because they are stories, they're very compelling and also very, I want to say, handy to spread a message of hope through law, which are mechanisms that sometimes we're unaware of. So very thankful for that. Before we go to the next speaker, there's a couple of questions that have come to you in the Q&A box, and I will extend them to you if that's okay. So one of them, which I find quite relevant, is from Kushi, who says, following the doctrine of parens patriae and species best interest standard, shouldn't animal slaughter for food and clothing be illegal? Over to you on this one.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And I said, you know, but what the court has said, unfortunately, is that it said that, you know, subject to exceptions provided under the law, right? So they actually said they must be given dignity, honor, subject to exceptions provided under the law. And sadly, our law allows for slaughter, right, of domestic animals.
It's
and
back.
therefore,
Yeah.
the least that we can do there, we say, is, well, even when they are slaughtered, give them dignity. Don't unnecessarily confer cruelty to them. Don't tie them. Don't beat them. You know, don't subject them to something which can be very clearly avoided. And today, when we look at it here, you know, the greatest amount of torture is not in the killing of the animal, but in the transportation of the animal. The way the animal is starved, beaten, one. This is where we rob the animal of dignity in the process that leads to the slaughter. So my point is that it is unfortunately not illegal to slaughter animals, but what is definitely illegal is to cruelly treat them, torture them, brutally abuse them, and that, I think, is where law comes in.
Okay, so there has been some amount of implementation of this law in terms of how the animals are treated.
See, I'll be very honest about it. You know, we have not made much progress with regard to cruelty on animals. Right. You know, that is a law where even as an institution, I must say that, you know, we have not also succeeded. We have not put the required amount. The Indian law says one animal cannot be slaughtered in the sight of another animal, in the presence of another animal. You go to any place, whether it's north, they're always there, seeing the kin being slaughtered in front of their eyes. So therefore, there is a lot of violation, and this is one area that as a group, we want to really work on. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's written in the law, right? So there's a lot of frustration in converting that into enforcement. Actually, there's another question relating to enforcement from Radhika, who asks, why are there no criminal penalties in environmental cases? It seems like bureaucrats and politicians lie on official papers and still no action is taken against them. And why is it so? Is there no provision in the Indian jurisprudence for penalizing government official who lies like this? Over to you.
Yeah, so the provisions are there. You know, the provisions are there to make them criminally liable. You know, but what we have found, to be very, very honest, is taking a very realistic view. These matters go before criminal courts. The moment you put it as a criminal case, it goes before a criminal court. Now, there is a judge who is already overburdened. They have a sequence of cases. Here is a murder case. Here's a dowry abuse case. Here's a theft case. Here's this is a rape case. So these are the kind of cases that come to them. In between, suddenly I bring in, said, my lord, there is this case where they have concealed the information with regard to rare and endangered species. Now, in that clogged judicial system, you know, the reality is that nobody gets punished, right? And also, very importantly, you know, we have been representing a lot of communities all across, and many of them actually say very strangely, let us be very frank, send the officer to jail, but ensure that we get clean air, water and all, because that is what we want. You know, because who is sent to jail under the system that we have is actually the person who is the least person, is the person who's actually not responsible for it. So the person who would have directed a clerk or a lower division officer to sign the document is not really the person who's actually at fault. And there's no record to show that it is based on the pressure put in by person. So if you look at the documents, it's signed by a divisional forest officer, it's signed by an undersecretary. Though it is signed by them, that person is not the decision maker. That decision maker is somewhere. So this is the problem that we have in trying to get criminal law in motion there. What we try to say is rather civil penalty. Let the government compensate by 1 crore, 10 crore fine, 20 crore fine, restore the area, you know, and in an ideal world, sending them to jail is a good deterrent. In reality, in the current Indian system, it doesn't really work.
It seems that there, you know, the challenges of this particular you know, the law system is relates to a resource constraint, as you mentioned, and the number of people who are actually available in mind and in time to solve the environmental issues beyond other criminal penalties, and the responsibility and liability and identification of the actual people that are responsible at the top of the decision-making chain. Very, very interesting points. Do we have enough time for a couple more questions? You lead the session, so you tell me. There's a couple more questions for you, Ritwik.
I'm fine with it. I can.
You're fine?
Yes.
Okay, let's try to give them a try. So again, Radhika is asking, this is a question that came up during your early slides about all of the acts that you presented. And she wonders what kind of amendments and what is the current status of the Forest Act of apparently 1927, which I was not aware of the date of, but what would you say on this one?
No, see, I think, you know, if you see the government is trying to amend the 1927 Act. And, you know, as a group, we have opposed it on various grounds. First and foremost is India is not governed by the 1927 Indian Forest Act. You know, Indian Forest Act of 1927 is applicable only to few states. Even when you look at Northeast, Indian Forest Act does some. The Indian Forest Act does not apply to Arunachal Pradesh. So if you look at all the states, they have had their own law, whether it is Kerala, whether it's Karnataka, whether it's Andhra Pradesh. So what we are saying is that by amending the Forest Act by the central government, you want one law for all forest. That's not going to work. Second, what has happened was that the government said, we will engage a private law firm to amend the Indian Forest Act. We as a group opposed it, saying, law drafting is not the work of either civil society group or of law firms. It's a job of bureaucrats to draft it. It's for parliamentarians to pass it. It is for public to give comments on it. And luckily for us, a good thing that has happened for everyone is yesterday the government decided to withdraw its invitation to give private consultancy the right to draft the law and, you know, prepare it. So as of today, we don't see the act being amended, but there is a process to amend the Forest Conservation Act. And that, I think, is a very dangerous move, because the aim, if you look at it, is essentially to facilitate. Actually, the name is Forest Conservation Act, but where it has been implemented is actually to facilitate the diversion and destruction of forest. And I think we till the 1st of November is the time frame given for public comments on the Forest Conservation Act. And I think it's very, very important for every group across the country, and especially in the Northeast, which is the biodiversity hotspot, to ensure that any dilution in the forest conservation does not take place.
It sounds like a familiar process of the environmental assessment, impact assessment amendment that happened a couple of, was it last year, where this kind of public consultation was actually not really really taken into account. Are you afraid, or are you seeing again with this one?
It might happen, but I think they have learned the lesson. And if you see, the EIA amendment that they were trying to do has still not come out. And,
right.
And the government today had agreed, after finally 1 year, that they will translate it into all the 22 languages that are mentioned in the Indian Constitution. And you know, my point has been that that's not good enough. You know, the Indian Constitution does not mention Garo, does not mention Khasi, right? So there are a lot of languages of the Northeast which still do not figure in the 22 list of languages. So how do you achieve that? So in a way, I think the victory is that from 2 languages, they've agreed to 22. But our struggle is that they must be made available in the language that the people understand, and not just those mentioned in the Indian Constitution, because many of the languages of Northeast are not mentioned in the Indian Constitution itself.
And for them to take the law into their understanding in their own hands as a tool for change, it's important that they, of course, have access to this content in their own language. Absolutely, good point.
Absolutely.
Yes. One last question. Well, that's a promise, and then we move on to the next speaker. Comes from Rahul. Rahul, I think, has a good point, and it'd be interesting for you to hear for your opinion, Ritwik, on this. Northeast is a biodiversity hotspot, as we were mentioning, and also a source of hydropower. Knowing that hydropower is also a good. Often considered as a more sustainable, less polluting source of energy and electricity. How do you kind of reconcile and balance out on these different topics?
Yeah, see, first and foremost, many a times when I argue a case, this is the question that judges say, right. The potential, the hydropower potential of India or Northeast is this many megawatt.
Right.
And, many a times, I don't give answers exactly science-based. I give it in terms of science, in terms of more common sense. And my answer to that is, somebody said that every human being only uses only 10% of the potential brain capacity.
Right?
I've heard
that too. Yes,
right?
Correct.
We some 7% and 8%. And the question is, everybody does not, we use only about 20% of our body's energy capacity. Right now, everybody does not want to be an Olympic sprinter. Everybody does not want to become an Einstein. So therefore, this idea that potential is 80% and potential is 10,000 megawatt or 1 lakh megawatt. Well, the river also wants to flow. The potential is how many species of plants and animals it is sustaining and will be able to sustain is also a potential that we have to look at. So therefore, I always say that if we had applied rather than 8% of our brain and maybe 80% of our brain capacity, we will recognize that, destruction of environment is not development. And therefore, this is not what it means to be. And a flowing river has aesthetic value. It has spiritual value. It has ecological value. And above all, it has economic value. And we have to recognize that as a living entity, a forest is also an industry which produces oxygen and water and does flood moderation to benefit all of it. So in economic terms, preservation of environment in its existing form is realizing its full potential, not destroying it. By destroying nature, by destroying river on the ground of hydropower, we actually diminish and finish off its potential at a much higher, at a level where, so many other benefits could have been achieved.
Rahul, I don't know about you, but I was very convinced by this compelling, response. Thank you. I was mind blown, actually. It's very true, Ritwik, what you just said on this point. I might quote you in the future on,
Yes. And I don't claim any copyright, so you don't need to quote me. Please feel free to use it as your own quote. The message should go through.
Great. Will you be able to share your slides? It wasn't another.
Yes.
Great.
I've emailed it already to Kona. She can send it to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ritwik. It was wonderful to hear from you. Thank you so much. I'll leave it to Kankana for the next.
And thank you. And for anything with regard to Northeast, we'll be always there.
Thank you so much, Ritwik. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Kankana, over to you.
Thank you. So can I share my screen as well?
Yes, you should be able to. Please go ahead.
Is it visible?
Yes, please go ahead. We can see
Okay.
it.
Yeah, so just where the last presentation and discussion ended, I think I must take from there only. So talking about this Biological Diversity Act, why important? I think we already have heard a little bit from Ritvik's presentation, the need for biodiversity and biodiversity hotspots India is having. So talking about the need for biodiversity, Biological Diversity Act, India is one of the 17 mega biodiverse countries in the world. And it actually is a home to 96,000 species of animal, 47,000 species of plants, and nearly half the world's aquatic plants. So you can imagine the need and the necessity for why biological diversity and biodiversity needs to be conserved in this country. To add to that, another important aspect is it is having a crucial linkage with the livelihood and well-being of millions of people of this country. So recently, United Nations has announced this announcement of UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration for the next 21 to 2030. But way before that, this Biological Diversity Act of India came in place in 2002. That was largely to give effect on the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which India is a party to it. So to give a effect of this international treaty, India has came up with this act called Biological Diversity Act. The objective was conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, and fair and equitable sharing of benefits. So which is arising out of the use of biological resources, knowledge, and the matters associated. So that's the exactly objective of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which was signed in 5th June in Rio de Janeiro. So to give that effect, this was the act that came in place in 2002. And to fulfill this objective, India has 3-tier enforcement mechanism system, which is at the apex level, the National Biodiversity Authority, at the state level, the State Biodiversity Board, and at the local level, the Biodiversity Management Committee. So largely talking about their functions of these bodies roams around the necessity of regulating or granting approval to any activities which involve access to biological resources or obtaining biological resources for their commercial utilization or for any biosurvey or any other purposes. It also gives the National Biodiversity Authority can also give advice to state governments and central governments on matters which actually related to any way for the conservation of biodiversity and its sustainable use. So talking about giving advice to state government, National Biodiversity Board is also responsible in giving advice to State Biodiversity Board in selection of various important biodiversity area in the state, which can be identified and notified as biodiversity heritage sites, and some measures for their management. Similarly, the State Biodiversity Board is also having capacity and the main function also to regulate the commercial utilization of biological resources by Indians by granting or regulating their approvals for their usage for any commercial purpose or for any other bioutilization purposes. Talking about the Biodiversity Management Committee, this is the lowest strata level of this enforcement agency and an important pillar of this Biodiversity Act, because it needs to be constituted by every local bodies at both in the rural and urban areas. And the objective again is to promoting conservation and sustainable use and documentation of this biological diversity. So I'll come later on that documentation of biological diversity is an important task of this Biodiversity Management Committee, which is constituted at every local level. In fact, Biodiversity Management Committee can charge a collection fee also from the person who are accessing or collecting any biological resources for commercial purposes. So talking about the PBR, what exactly is the PBR process? Like what I said, that documentation of biological diversity. PBR is basically a document which is having compilation of information on locally available biological resources. and traditional knowledge associated with them. So it is very important to acknowledge the word traditional knowledge. This plays an important role in this Biological Diversity Act, that People's Biodiversity Register preparation will be completely participatory in nature, so that extensive and intensive consultation process with a maximum number of local people, as maximum as possible, can be done, so that their share of knowledges, their share of specific knowledges, knowledge with respect to any species or any plant or any habitats, can be captured in the document, so that the traditional knowledge which they are passing from one generation to another is getting documented and preserved. And most importantly, this PBR will have to be dynamic. As you can understand, this species, plant species or whatever animal species or any other kind of biological resources, their presence, their frequency, their appearance, all are getting changed over time to time, over the period of years. So the elderly the people are, they can see the changes happening, and they can actually connect with the reasons which are leading to such kind of changes that is happening in those resources existence. So that's why traditional knowledge is given an important part under this PBR preparation. It also helps in preservation of traditional knowledge. As I said, that one generation to another generation, passing on this information was largely verbal in nature. It was nothing have any documentation in place. So when it was passing on from one generation to another generation, there's a chances of getting lost in between. So making a PBR is actually helping preserving those traditional knowledges. And also this PBR is an important tool which actually while identifying those biological resources, the traditional knowledge of people can be used to get to know which exactly is the actual or potential value of a particular biological resources. Say, for example, medicinal plant value or any other importance of a particular species that are there. PBR, another important use is countering the false EIA reports. You heard how this Nyamjanchu reverse hydropower project of Tawang Valley struggled with presence of black-necked crane in the timely manner when it was needed to establish that this site is an historic wintering site for this habitat. So for this species. So given the presence of PBR, this kind of arrival or this kind of biological diversities of a particular region could have been documented. I'd like to share another example of a similar struggle from Kinnaur district of HP, where the Himachal Pradesh, where the people were really struggling to save their pine nuts, chilgoza. That was really getting endangered and getting threat from the proposed hydropower project of Kashan. What was the situation is the local people there used to depend on this livelihood, on this chilgoja nuts, and every household actually manages per year almost 200 kgs of this chilgoja. And the market value, if you look at it, it's almost rupees 1,000 to 1,200, which means rupees 2 to 2.5 lakh annual income per year per household. But the EIA report has never mentioned this important species livelihood connectivity while making those documents, while making those EIA reports. So in this kind of situations, PBR becomes an important tool to counter those false EIA reports which are being placed to get the prior environmental clearance. Talking about the penalty, yes, this act also has a provisions for penalizing if anyone is contravening any provisions of the act. That penalty goes for imprisonment up to 5 years or the fines, which may extend up to 10 lakh rupees. But again, that's a question of further applicability. So as I mentioned, people play an integral part in this particular act, because even in the Nagwa Protocol, which was attached to the Convention on Biological Diversity, has also acknowledged the traditional knowledge of the people and the association people is having while having natural presence in sync with the natural habitat. The Act specifically says that central government shall endeavor to respect and protect the knowledge of local people. And in cases of projects which is likely to have adverse effect on biological diversity, if environment impact assessment is being conducted, public participation will have to make arrangements as people get an priority under this biodiversity conservations and natural resource preservations. Fair and equitable benefit sharing is again an important part, the one of the most key objective of this Biological Diversity Act. So the benefit is those benefits which are arising out of the use of these biological resources or the traditional knowledge associated with it. And that use can be for any purposes, for commercial use, for R&D or any other subsequent applications. Whatever benefits are coming up, those benefits have to be shared equitably in a mutually agreed terms and conditions. Between whom? Between the persons who is using the resources and the local bodies and the benefit claimers, who are the basically the locals who were actually preserving or having or actually living with the nature, in sync with the nature for the years, for the ages to come. In fact, India is a party to this Nagoya Protocol, which is also aimed to ensure this fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of these genetic resources. Ritvik has already mentioned about these cases. This is really a unique matter. So the history of this entire judgment, I am not getting into, but some portion which court has really came out with some specific orders that Uttarakhand High Court has came out with on this Divya Pharmacy judgment is really very interesting. It has clearly mentioned that some of the points I would like to highlight here, that indigenous and local communities who either grow biological resources or have a traditional knowledge of these resources are the beneficiaries under the Act. In return for their parting with this traditional knowledge, certain benefits accrue to them, which is called fair and equitable benefit sharing is all about. The court has also in fact highlighted in this matter that Nagoya Protocol makes no distinction between a foreign entity and an Indian entity as regards their obligation towards local and indigenous community. Therefore, if any ambiguities in the national statute comes in, so it has to be seen in the light of the international treaty, that is Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol. And then only we can arrive at the true meaning of fair and equitable benefit sharing. Court has also stated that State Biodiversity Board has the power to impose fees because being a regulatory body, regulating an activity in form of a demanding of a fee is an accepted practice recognized in law. So the State Biodiversity Board can surely demand a fee in the form of FEBS, a fair and equitable benefit sharing from the petitioner, that is Divya Pharmacy. When Divya Pharmacy is admittedly mentioning that they are using these biological resources for commercial purposes. So the board has full power to impose fine on them. So let's have a look at the implementation progress of this Act. So since it has been come in place in 2002, almost 2 decades are in place. If we say at the initial level in 2017, the PBR preparation, which is one of the important mandate of this Biological Diversity Act, was only 7% of the total BMC that was constituted. So that is where our advocacy actions, where we have fought for this issue and took up to NGT on this matter, this Chandrabal Singh versus Union of India. There we got to see when we initiated this matter in National Green Tribunal, only 9,700 BMC was constituted, and among them only 1,388 has been prepared PBRs. By last year, 2020 August, the total number of BMC constituted 265,725, and the total number of PBRs prepared 196,000. So that is where the litigation took some success, and in terms where the total number BMC, if you can see the left column, was supposed to be 275,000 in total. Now we have at least 265,000 BMCs in place, which is near more than 90% of the total requirement. So that's how my presentation is. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, Kankana. I was just snacking on a biscuit. Sorry about this. Thank you so much for all of this super informative content. And it's very interesting to understand how, again, we can use this as really tools for change. There has been a couple of questions dropped in the Q&A box. I think what would be great, Violeta, let me know if it's possible, is if we can let Palden maybe directly address Kankana and ask the questions that he has directly. Is it possible?
Hello. Hello. Can you come again? It cuts in between. Sorry.
Sorry. I was just asking Violeta if it was possible for Palden to directly ask his questions, just to make sure that I don't there you go, Palden. Can you unmute yourself and ask the questions that you have directly to Kankana?
Hi, Kankana. Are you audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, okay. My question was like, why is Biodiversity Act 2002 not very effective in rural areas of India, and like how can the NGOs or the civil society create the BMC, that is biodiversity managing acts at the local level with the community participation and primarily in tribal villages or the villages residing inside the protected forest?
So talking about the rural area, it's not only the situation in rural area, but little bit in city area as urban area as well. The problem is NGOs can be taken participations in the if the committee members, because urban local bodies are generally making the hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So the point is, NGOs generally ULBs, like at the ULB level, this committee are to be constituted, and while constituting, the local NGOs can be consulted, and most of the time what is happening, local NGOs are directly not getting the members of this BMC unless they are having any specific situations, because there are situations where NGOs are also getting a member of these BMCs, but at the same time these NGOs can also help in documenting the PBR. So when the PBR is being prepared, say for example, BMC members directly generally don't go and do the PBR making, which ideally they should. So those kind of PBR making process can be initiated by these NGOs who are actually working and having knowledge on these local issues. In fact, some of the districts in West Bengal is having such practice initiated. There are professors, school teachers who are being part of these BMCs. There are NGO members who are also part of these BMCs if they have expertise and they have the understanding of the issue. So NGO it. And talking about the enforcement, yes, it was 20 years of act in place. Enforcement is a little bit slow, and that way the constitution of BMC by now has still become a little bit of progress. As I mentioned, that when in 2016 we did the case initiated in NGT, it was just few of them in place, and when by now we have almost more than 90% of BMCs are operational. So constitution of BMCs took quite a little time, unless other than a few states like Kerala or so. But otherwise, NGOs can take part in the constitution of BMCs. They can be the member of BMCs and they can be initiative of making the PBR in place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kankana. Thank you, Palden, for your question. There is one more that has come for you, Kankana, maybe before we go to Rahul.
Yes.
So the question is, why should communities prepare PBR even when the use of finances of the BMC is almost entirely in the hand of forest departments as of now? If community has no say on how to use the finances of the BMC, do we need amendments there for democratic power sharing?
See, giving money to the community is not the idea of making the PBR. as I mentioned, making the PBR idea is documenting the community knowledge. So community will not make the PBR, but community will be consulted in detail so that their indigenous knowledge, their inherited knowledge from year to year can be preserved, can be documented, and can be compiled in one place. So community is not making essentially the PBR document, but community is taking part in the participatory appraisal process, which the BMC is supposed to do. So community is not, yes, community students, community teachers are voluntarily being involved while making the PBR because they are having the maximum access to the local level, local populations, local understanding of the area, everything. So take, let's say an example of one of the districts in West Bengal. When we visited and meet with the people of BMC members, they were like, well, they were trying to document one area's what should say, the biological resources. So they also needed to have a proper map, local map of the area. So, and the understanding of the area. So a person might not have that level of understanding of that map interpretation, and that person can momentarily take help of a person who is having understanding of those mapping interpretation. Say for a teacher or a professor having background of geography or something like that. But that does not mean that community is doing the PBR preparation. It's also always a responsibility of the BMC. So if the fund is coming to the BMC, the fund is supposed to come to the BMC for PBR preparation. And if this fund is coming to the BMC, so it ideally should be used by them to do the consultative process, to which should cover the entire village, village periphery, the buffer zone, everything, as much as that BMC's jurisdiction falls in place. So that can be the role of BMC, and that way public and community can be engaged in the preparation process, because they are the one who is living with the nature, in sync with the nature, in harmony with the nature. So they can only tell you the best part of when a species is getting maximum flowering, or when a species is not getting, it should not be plugged in, so that they will not get a time to regenerate. So those kind of information a community who is living in sync with the nature can provide you, but they can, and that's why they need to be consulted. So PBR should be prepared by the BMC only, and therefore the money coming to BMC should be utilized by the BMC.
Thank you so much, Kankana, for this really, again, informative session with you. I think we have another 20 minutes of insights. Give me 1 second. Okay, I was just reading what Vivek was mentioning in the chat. Kankana, if there's any clarification that maybe you can send in the chat, or you feel that you bounce on what has been said, don't hesitate to do this in writing.
Sure.
Or as a follow-up, we'll follow up with Vivek. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And welcome, Rahul, to the table. It's over to you for the next and the last 20 minutes altogether. Rahul, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just
we can see the slides. We can't see you anymore, Rahul. I don't know if you can switch on your video.
just a minute.
Sure.
You can see the slide, but I don't know how this is happening. But shall I continue with like this, or?
Yes, let's continue it like this. We see the slide. We hear you very well. So let's go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think Ritvik has already set the tone with respect to the issues and the basic laws. Now, whatever time I have focus on the waste management issue, because one of the issue, like many of us are urban resident, and then now even in the rural area, this waste is a major issue. And I think the Central Pollution Control Board has also identified this as a NIMBY syndrome. So if you see their reports, this mention whenever anyone goes for the selecting the site, this not in my backyard syndrome is there. So when we talk about the waste, so we have few laws. There are other laws also, but these are the main laws, and all the laws has come under the umbrella of the Environment Protection Act 1986. So you can say that the Environment Protection Act is an umbrella act, and under that act there is a power by which the central government can come out with the laws, and under which they have come out with a few of the laws which are for the plastic, municipal solid waste, biomedical waste, hazardous waste, and e-waste. So and construction and demolition waste. So why solid waste? Because so there is an information. The CPCB like comes with the annual reports, and then this is the figure which respect to the solid waste which is there. Now we have 1,41,064 tons per day of solid waste. Now the figure which they are saying that 90% is collected and 27% is processed. If we see the other reports, I don't think this figure can be totally accepted.
Rahul,
most of
very sorry to cut you. You're still on the first slide. Is it? Have you moved forward, or is it normal?
Yeah. So it's not. I think
I'll try to share it. Reshare it once more. It happened to me in the past. Usually, when you reshare it, it should work again. Hopefully.
No, is screen sharing my Firefox.
Are you managing to share the screen?
I think it's automatically switch off my video somehow.
It's okay. Let's try to get.
But
it seems so. Let's try to get the slide sharing moving forward as you speak along. That would be great. If you can try to share your screen. Yes, perfect. Great. Now it's all good. We are on the second slide with you. Yeah.
Now it's moving. Slide is moving.
All
Fine.
good now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rahul.
Fine. Fine. So, so now I was talking about this figure which is the Central Pollution Control Board has given with respect to the amount of waste which they are saying that is being collected and processed. It's difficult to accept because the waste which you see lying all over, and one of the main concern is the burning of waste. So entire waste you see all over is being burned even in the cities, and there is almost no collection in the rural areas, and the amount of waste in the hilly areas which is being disposed of directly. So I think the person who is dealing with the waste can understand. And then if we see with respect to the West Bengal is 14,613 ton per day. And then there also it has been claimed by the Pollution Control Board that 13,000 of waste is being collected. But here the treatment of the waste is only 916 ton per day. So where all these other waste are going is, it may not be a mystery, but it's not documented in a way which we can have say. So we had earlier the solid waste management rule. I think the slides are moving, I hope, because I moved the slides.
Yes, all good.
Yeah. So This is Solid Waste Management Rule 2016. So earlier there was a 2000 rule, which has now been changed. And then in this rule, if we see, the more focus is given on segregation. And also they have included the other areas like the village panchayat, and then there is a different like railways. So they are also responsible and then are guided by the solid waste management rule. So being segregation at its core of the rule is the provision, or you can say the mandate of the rule is being completely violated. It's very difficult. Like you can see whatever waste is being collected or reaching in the landfill, it's all mixed waste. Now, what would be the problem with the mixed waste? I think we'll just come to that when we see that how one is dealing with the waste. So one is the source segregation, and then responsibility of the generators has also been defined. So there would be like individual generators like me and you, and there can be a bulk generator like some multi-storied apartments, office blocks, and that so on. And the responsibility of the generator is that they should segregate the waste at source. And when they are segregating, this dry waste has to go to either the authorized rack pickers, and in most of the cases where there is a gated communities, their compostable waste has to be composted at the site. This is the requirement, but I don't think, because we have checked the several places. We have checked in the Delhi, we have checked in the surrounding area where we are based, and I think some in Calcutta. There is we have seen the proper collection, but here the segregation is at all not being complied, and entire waste is a mixed waste which is being, and then most of the gated communities are not complying with this requirement that all the compostable waste has to be segregated and composted inside their premises. And another issue with respect to the waste is the burning of waste. It's not only on the site, like this horticulture department in the parks, you have collected the waste, and then all the waste are collected are being burned, which is obviously one of the major reasons for this air pollution. And even in the stringent directions which are there in Delhi, you will find at one place or other this horticulture waste are being burned. But also this household waste, you'll see that some of the shopkeepers find it means through burning, it's pure process of disposing of or something is their understanding. So what they would do in the morning, they will collect entire waste in the front of their shop and then burn the entire waste, including plastic or any other material which is harmful. So this kind of thing is very much visible. You drive through any semi-urban areas, and then rather than collecting the waste and proper disposal, even you will see that municipal corporation itself is involved in doing this kind of activity in burning the entire waste. So under the solid waste rules, one is the segregation, but at the same time, the segregated waste, what has to reach landfill? Now, only those either which cannot be recycled or which cannot be composted has to reach landfills. But still, you will find that the entire mixed waste, whether it's a plastic, whether it's a medical waste, is reaching to the landfill. And when the medical waste is reaching to the landfill, that also shows that this there is a complete violation of the biomedical waste rules also, which also require a separate procedure is there with respect to how to deal with the biomedical waste rules and biomedical waste. Now, as per the Act, we have like where the sanitary landfill can be. So it has to be 100 meters away from the rivers, 200 meters away from the ponds and water bodies. And there are not one, several instances where, forget about the 200 meters from the ponds or the water bodies, the waste are being dumped in the water bodies to fill up and reclaim those water bodies as such. And it has to be 100 meters from the high flood zone, and also eco-fragile. Now, eco-fragile again is a difficult thing to define. Maybe some area now, if one landfill is close to a forest area, whether that would be considered by the government as an eco-fragile area. And so one portion is a landfill, another portion is setting up a processing plant. So for setting up a processing plant also, there is a provision with respect to the how much buffer zone has to be maintained. Now, as per the CPCB guidelines, so even outside the premises of the buffer zone, the area which is they have to maintain as a no development zone, it can be around 200 meters, so minimum. And still means we have been doing the cases where this compliance is also not there. Now, maybe the land has been acquired 10 years back, but if you have not declared the land where you have proposed the solid waste processing plant, it can be just a processing plant, or also it can be waste to energy plant, and which is, so you have not declared that area as a no development zone 200 meters. And in entire 200 meters, school and then apartments have come up, and now you want to set up those plants. And the government has approved those kind of proposals, and then Pollution Control Board has also been giving permissions. See, this is one of the plant in Bareilly. So the site which you can see here where this dump is, this was proposed, it was some 5 years back, that this land has to be used for the management of solid waste. It's not only landfill, but they also have a solid waste treatment facility there. Now they share common boundary with one of the university there. Now how it can be possible under the rules, but still they have been allowed to continue there as this facility. And they approached the court, and then result was, it's still in some manner they have a dumping site, but they have to maintain that distance from the area where they have located their facility. Now this is in the Aravallis, and this is a huge landfill which caters to two of the districts, Faridabad and Gurgaon. And for like last 5 years, now if you see the rules, this landfill should not have been here. But the entire lichet is going in the forest area, and then there are wild animals which are dependent on that, whatever water bodies is there. There are reports that the water table of the nearby villages has been contaminated. So the entire groundwater which they extract, and there are reports with respect to how they are getting affected because of this. So I'm just go quickly, I think they're not. And one of the proposal is with respect to the Indore model, I think which has been talked about, and NGTA as the Green Tribunal has been asking the different areas to adopt the Indore model. But other than Indore, I don't think anywhere it has been replicated. Even if replicated, there is a huge, I think, pressure or some kind. This new rules also talks about this waste to energy plant. So the new rule talks about a waste to energy plant. Government is proposing waste to energy plant, but the problem is that in India, it has a complete failure with respect to waste to energy plant. In Delhi, we have, I think, 3 to 4 waste to energy plant, and the first waste to energy plant was opened here, which got shut after 2-3 years of operation because the kind of waste which was reaching was not capable to produce energy because of the calorific value which was not there because of the mixed waste, all this wet waste and then dry waste which was reaching there. So So this was a report, I think it is in 2019, and there are other reports also with respect to that, how this waste to energy plant has completely failed. And if you search internet, you will find the lots of good thing about waste to energy plant, that if it is managed well, then it can do wonders and then help with the proper disposal of the waste. But with the experience who a person living close to the waste to energy plants, this is a completely, I think, nightmare kind of thing, when suddenly they will find that the entire household is covered with the smoke. And when their stacks was monitored, it was found that it is a high level of dioxins which are there found. So means there's certainly a no for the waste to energy plant. And I think we'll have to see that how to stop, because it's not only in Delhi and then surrounding areas, it is now reaching into each and every city as per the proposal. And then so if we do away with the waste to energy plant, then we'll have to move to the circular economy, and then rather than linear economy, where in the linear economy we produce and dispose, and mostly through incinerator. And then in the circular economy, we have like when we produce, we repair, we reuse, and then so the disposal would be the last stage for that. And we have biomedical waste rules, where all this biomedical waste has to be managed. And I think I'll just quickly go to the action point, because and on the plastic also, there are lots of laws which has been come up, but it's again a huge issue of compliance. Now, if you see the rise in the plastic consumption in India from 96 to 2007 and 2017, but with respect to the compliance, we are completely failure in that. And then again, with respect to the data, the CPC we produce is completely problematic, where they say that 60% are recycled. You can just let me know when I have to stop, because I think I'm doing it fast, but it's still. So one of the report which was there, that 90% of the pollution is from the 10 of the rivers, which are Asian river, and I think one or two rivers are also from India. This, I think, everyone might be aware that this video, no time left, so I'll not play this video, but you can just search for the plastic river, and you will find that in the hill area, as per the rule of the solid waste management rule, you cannot create landfill. But this is video from the Himachal, where the entire waste has flown in the river. And I'll just come to the action point. So on the action, what we can do is we can go to the one approach is one can go to the trial court, but also one can go to the National Green Tribunal, and there we can have application filed under section 14 for non-compliance of the provisions of the rules. So I think the time is getting up. I should stop here.
Rahul, you could take 1 or 2 minutes more to finish the action points if you want to.
Okay. Okay. So see, in the why NGT, one is because the other courts were finding it difficult to deal with the environmental matters, because there are lots of technical aspects involved. Like even in the solid waste, how to manage it, maybe on the face of it, it would be easy, but when you go more into it, it's kind of lots of technical issues also involved. So to do away with the technicalities, the National Green Tribunal has one judicial member who is either retired from the Supreme Court or the High Court. And one, we have a technical member who is has an expertise on the environmental issues. So that makes it convenient for them to understand the issue. And then because an Environment Protection Act is covered under the NGT Act, so any violation of the Environment Protection Act rules covered under the NGT Act, and one can approach there. And one of the issue is who can approach. So NGT has given a very wide jurisdiction that anyone who is affected, and then under the Constitution also we have a duty. So the fundamental duty to protect the environment under 51 AG. So, and there are cases, for example, when we are talking about the Bandwari case, then for the Bandwari, for the Gurgaon, the leachate, when the area is contaminated, one can approach and then file a case saying that if our groundwater has been affected, you need to restore those areas. And so the time limit is there, but still I think one can very well see that how to manage those time. This is just one of the case where this water was contaminated and that person approached to the NGT to take up the issues. And like industrial pollution, so and the issue with respect to the groundwater extraction. And like this is the one of the case where the entire hazardous waste was escaped from the premises of the project proponent and damaged the agriculture field. So those person also approached to the NGT. So anyone having any clarification with respect to how to approach or to means further cases, then certainly we can be of. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for extending it.
Thank you, Rahul, for such an informative presentation. I will now invite Kankana to give a brief about LIFE and just like how Rahul said, how organizations and individuals can collaborate with LIFE to know more about environmental laws. Kankana, could you please take a minute?
Yeah, I will not take too much of time. Quickly, just to tell you, we are the Environmental Law Fund. We claim ourselves as that way, and we are very much there to support all communities or anyone who wants to save environment and who wants to make it for livelihood that's getting hampered because of any issues, any damage to the environment. We represent coastal communities, we represent fishermen. So there are groups with whom we are working on the ground level. If anyone really wants to approach us for this kind of issues, which involves environmental damage and or otherwise environmental damage leading to livelihood exploitations, we are always there to support those kind of groups. In fact, I would love to announce this recent award that we have received because of that only, Right Livelihood Award we received this year, 2021 Right Livelihood Award. So they acknowledge, which is also called an alternative Nobel as well. So they also acknowledged our continuous efforts and actions and the work which we are doing, the legal work with the communities to protect their resources and for the environmental democracy in India. So we are always there to help you in that sense for any kind of legal matters. For approach, we have a website. We have our website, which I will share with Aparupa. Otherwise, you can always get an access to them, or otherwise through my email ID, through our website, we have a query posting system. Through them also, one can approach us, and then we can take up the issue. But yes, of course, one important thing which always needed, the community support while we are going to the ground, that will be required. Because most of the time, many a times, if not always, it happens that community is reaching to us. We are trying to make the field visits. We are trying to get it documented, the issues that are reaching to us. But then we are not getting the support from the communities representing the local areas. So those kind of community support will be needed. Without that, we won't be able to do much of the groundwork that is needed to be done to make a case strong and to make the litigation happens in a right track, right direction. So those kind of community support from the ground will also be needed, but otherwise, whatever is requirement in terms of environmental issues or in terms of community livelihood rights violations, we are always there to support them.
Thank you very much, Sana, for this overview of life. And to all the attendees, thank you for patiently staying on, even though we overshot the time. And thank you to the experts as well for the same. Don't worry, we will share all the recordings and the presentations that we shared today to all the attendees. With this, I would like to close the session for today. And thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Aparupa and Vice team, all of you.
Yeah, thank you.